that's the family that I grew up in. My oldest sister is adopted. My older brother and I are both bios, and then my younger brother and sister are both adopted. So this is kind of what I grew up in. And so to talk to you about the experience of a bio child in a foster and adoptive family, I feel like that is a better credential than even me being also an adoptive. And when I prepared for, really for me, it was a very full circle experience, kind of in thinking through my experience as a kid, growing up in a foster and adoptive family, my experiences as a parent, having my oldest son as a bio child, and then our youngest 3 kids are adopted through foster care, thinking through his experience, our third adoption, or our second adoption actually, of our third child, also involved our other kids who by that point were permanent kids in our family. So really for me, what kept coming back to me was this was God's plan for me my whole life, and I didn't know it, right? So before the foundations of the earth, he knew who I was and how I would be raised and the family that I would grow up in, and how he would create in me a desire to be in a foster and adoptive family, but he would also use my own experience as a child in a biological family. So that's kind of where I'm coming from tonight, is that threefold experience. Being that the next slide is a picture of my family of origin. So that's me on the far right. My oldest sister was a infant domestic adoption. My parents adopted her thinking that they weren't going to have bio kids because they had issues with fertility. And then surprise, along came my brother. And then I was the ultimate surprise and the biggest blessing, I'm sure. And then we adopted brother. He was a foreign adoption from Mexico, and he was the last foreign adoption out of Mexico before they closed foreign adoptions. And then my little sister was a foster baby that we got from birth and had for about 18 months, and then she had a relative adoption that was disrupted. She came back into foster care and back into our family and then never left. So we did foster care off and on my whole childhood until we adopted my sister. And then I would say we informally did foster care the rest of my childhood. My parents just continued to sort of bring people into our family who were not our relatives to be part of our family, to come alongside other families who were fostering and adopting. So really that's kind of my whole life story. And then this is my current family. I have 4 boys. Like I said, my oldest is, the next slide is a picture of my kids. So the next, my oldest son is the one on the bottom picture on the far right. He's 9. He was born to us biologically. And then my middle 2 are biological brothers. They came to us through foster care. They were almost 2 and almost 4. And they came into our home, so now they're 6 and 8. And then our middle guy, we finalized his adoption in February, and he was 17 days old when he came to us. So that's my crew. Those are my people, and we continue to be certified. Right now, I don't know what the plan is for us. I think our cup is pretty full at 4, but we continue to kind of walk alongside other families through this process. But those are the people that live in my home today. So my goals for tonight are really just a few things, hoping that you will kind of learn how to prepare the kids in your home for fostering and adoption. And if you've already gone through this process, maybe this is in the past for you, it's not too late to go back and do some of the things that we're going to talk about tonight. If your kids are bio kids in your home, or you have permanent kids who've been impacted by new placements coming and leaving, even if you didn't do some of the things that we're going to talk about tonight during that time, it's not too late to go back and have these conversations with your kids, or to ask them some of the questions about their experience, because as you all know, it's never over. It doesn't end once you finalize an adoption, or once a kid is reunified with a family and leaves your home. This process continues to impact your family and your children as they grow up and go through different phases developmentally. So it's not, oh my gosh, we didn't do it the right way the first time around. There's no right way. And hopefully there's something from tonight that you can take from this that you can apply to your kids and your family, regardless of where you're at in your process. So if you can go to the next slide so people can see, that would help. Thank you. And then really helping your kids adjust to this new normal. So once it happens, sort of the preparation phase, and then once it happens, how do we kind of adjust to what is new? And then really learn what resources are available to your family and your kids as an ongoing process. Because like I said, this doesn't stop just because you finalized your adoption. It will continue to impact your family and your kids, all your kids in your home. And then the next slide. So I've kind of broken this down into 3 phases really to think about, conceptualize. Really before you enter into the foster care and adoption process, I think it's really important that you count the cost. I think some people don't do this, and then afterwards they count the cost, and it's like overwhelming. But I think it's important to count what the cost will be to your family, and specifically not just to you as parents, but also to your kids. How will they be impacted by this in good and hard ways? And are we prepared for that? And what are we going to do when the rubber meets the road and things aren't easy? Really managing expectations and resentment. So what are my expectations about this process? What do I imagine fostering and adoption will look like for me and for my kids? And what might be the reality in between that? One of the things that happens that builds resentment is when we have unmet expectations. You know, I pictured it like this, and then it's not like that at all. You know, I pictured my kids would come into my home, and they would be thankful that I've rescued them from their hard life beforehand, and they would thank me every day, and that doesn't happen. It's like the opposite of that. I'm like the bane of their existence. And unfortunately, some people do have expectations like that, or it's somewhere kind of in the middle, right? It may not be that extreme, but it's like, I thought it would look like this. I thought our family would be like this, and now one of our kids has this issue, and so we have to adjust and turn this direction, and it looks completely different. So if we think about it ahead of time, it's a lot easier to manage our expectations and not build resentment when things don't go exactly as planned. And helping your kids know what to expect is a part of that process. So what can they expect this will look like for them? What can they expect this will look like for your family? And then really, the ultimate question is now the right time for us? And I have walked with a couple different families who's gone through this process of getting all the way to certification for foster care and stopping and then waiting because they realized that it wasn't the right time for their family. And a lot of that was based on what was going on with their kids that were already in their home. And there's nothing wrong with that. There's nothing wrong with realizing like one of my kids isn't ready, or we're going through something in our family right now that needs to be addressed and taken care of before we step into this thing. Or maybe we're never going to foster because we realize that my husband and I aren't on the same page, or one of my kids just is not on board, and we can be involved in this orphan care, supporting foster and adoptive families in another way. It doesn't have to be that we bring kids into our home. So I think those are really important before questions to ask. And then on the next slide, kind of the next part of the before is really, this is a family process. So as a family, we are entering into the process of foster care and adoption. It's not that mom and dad are called to fostering and adopting. It's that as an entire family, we're either going to do it together or we're not going to do it at all. And so we're a team. We do this as a team, right? We either do it all together or we don't do it at all. And that is really hard for some families to acknowledge that their kids, oh, thank you. I'm getting over a cold, so I apologize. Hopefully I don't hack up a lung. That maybe their kids aren't on board. And not that we want our kids to dictate our choices as parents, but if your kids aren't on board, they need to be on board, and we want to figure out why they're not. And it may just be a fear. Maybe they're anxious. Maybe they need to talk through some things they have questions about. And maybe there's other reasons that they're not on board. But if we're not a team, then when things get hard, it's going to be extra hard, right? Those cracks become really obvious and start to really show when things are hard. There's a podcast that I listened to, and one of the dads who's a foster dad, he said one of the mottos we have as a family is that this is just what our family does. Foster care is what our family does. And so when they're having a hard time or when things are difficult and they kind of get together and have family meetings, they remind themselves, this is what we do. This is what our family does. This is what we've been called to as a family. It's what we've agreed to do. And it's kind of the thing, the mantra that keeps them together when things are hard. A couple questions I think to ask yourself as a parent beforehand is, do we have buy-in from everyone? Is every member of our family, our immediate family, because you don't need buy-in from your, oh, thank you, extended family, but that's helpful too. Does everybody want to do this? They all agree? Are we all on the same page? And then is it okay to be honest and talk about the hard things honestly? So when my oldest son came to me and said, I hate this, I hate how hard this is on our family, I could have said, get over it. This is, what we signed up for. Life is hard. But I didn't. In my best moments, I can say, you're right, it is hard. It's hard, and it's okay for you to tell me that it's hard. It's okay for you to share with me how this impacts you and for me to tolerate your feelings about it. Doesn't mean that I'm doing the wrong thing as a parent. Doesn't mean your life is going to be ruined because this is hard. It just means that part of how we can continue to do this is that we can be honest about what it's like. Because if we can't be honest, then it goes back to that resentment piece, and we don't have buy-in from everybody. The other part is that, are you prepared to take a break when you need to? When your family needs a break, like right now, we're on a break, are you prepared to do that? I get calls and texts from our social worker, are you ready? Do you want another baby? And I say, I would love one. Do you want to buy me a bigger car and a bigger house, more time and more money, and less stress? And she's like, no, I can't do that for you. Okay, well, then I'm not ready, right? It's okay to take a break. It's okay to take a weekend or a week off when your family needs a break. It's okay to use respite. It's okay to say to your, like my oldest son has said to us, Mom, I don't want to do another baby right now. And I said, okay, we've talked about that. We've all agreed that this is not the time for us to be continuing to have kids come into our home. But I really think it's important that we all have a voice in that we all as a family can articulate when we might need a break, whether it's your kids or yourself as a parent. So going on to the next slide. I think I will probably say this 4 or 5 times, but the biggest thing is that you keep talking about it. So you talk about it before it happens, you talk about it while it's happening, and you talk about it after it happens. The more we talk about things with our kids, the more we normalize them, the more we give them a voice, which is part of how they feel safe. If we don't talk about it, they feel confused, they don't know what's going on, they feel like they can't use their voice, they act out more. So the more we talk about it, the better and the easier it will go. And this is just in preparation, but also as we go through the process. It's really important to be age appropriate. So if you have a 5-year-old and you're talking about foster care and bringing kids into your home, you're not going to tell them the same level of information that you would tell a 15-year-old. But you are going to talk about it as honestly as you can. Why are kids in foster care? Why do kids have to go live with other families? Why can't they be with their first mom or their first dad? Why do they have to go see them at this random place in the middle of town on a Wednesday at 10 o'clock in the morning? And then they come to our house. Why do you have to go to court all day long and come home at the end of the day and what happened, right? We talk about what it's going to be like, what's involved, what the expectations are. We talk about what changes will happen in our family. Am I bringing a kid in who's going to disrupt birth order? What will that be like? What kinds of behaviors might we expect from a kid who's coming from hard places coming into our home? They're not probably going to be easy to live with right away, right? They might act differently. They might say different things. They might bring language into our home that wasn't there before, or behavior into our home that wasn't there before. I remember trying to explain to one of my kids why we don't use certain words. Like all of a sudden this kid in our home is using very inappropriate language like it just was, a nice word to use. And explaining like why that's okay for him to say it. Well, it's not really okay, but he didn't know better. And why that's not a word that we want you to repeat, and explain to a mom in the playground why my kid is saying things like that. So it's really about managing expectations and helping kids have a realistic, honest expectation of what's going to happen. In the beginning of our process, I tried to shield our oldest son from some of those things. Like we didn't take him to and from drop-offs for visits because I thought that would be too hard to expose him to certain things. But really what ended up happening was it created a lot of confusion and anxiety for him because he's getting shuffled off to grandma and grandpa's house twice a week so that they can watch him while I'm taking the other kids to visits, and he's wondering where his brothers are going and why can't he see them. And is their mom a safe person? And why am I letting them go with people who aren't safe if they can't be with safe people? And so finally I thought, this is worse than taking him to the visitation place and letting him see people that maybe he wouldn't normally see, or experience things that maybe he wouldn't normally experience, because at least we're not dealing with all that anxiety and confusion. So for us, that was the right decision, because it really alleviated a lot of anxiety for him, and it helped him feel like he was a part of the process. So I think those are the kinds of things that we might not always think through ahead of time, but it's really important to talk through those pragmatic change pieces that are going to happen to your family, because your schedule gets so disrupted when you bring new kids home, even if they don't have things like visits. It's just the change of having a new family member. Just like when you have an infant born into your family, all of a sudden everything revolves around that new baby. So preparing kids for that change and bringing people on board who can help them through it and who can help you, support them is really important. And reassuring them that what will not change is their place in the family, especially kids who are adopted or who are in your home already through foster care. Because the change of the transition of having a new kid come into the home will naturally be a trauma trigger for your kids in your home who've already experienced that kind of change and loss. So being able to say to them, we are bringing a new kid into our family, and we don't know if they're going to stay forever or not, but you are here forever. You will never not be a part of our family. And you may have to say that over and over again, especially in the beginning, because they're thinking it, but they may not even be able to articulate to you that that's what their fear is. But that's a very natural fear for kids from hard places and for biological kids. Like, kids they leave their families and come to other families and then go back. What about me? So even just saying it out loud, even if they haven't expressed it, normalizing that might be a thought that they're having is really important, because it just brings down that anxiety without even having to have a disruptive experience about it. And then the next slide. So I think it's really important to expose, which you guys are already doing here, so this is kind of preaching to the choir, but exposing your kids to other foster and adoptive families. They need to be around other families that are like them. Your bio kids need to be around other bio kids who have foster and adoptive siblings. They need to know that this is normal. I grew up in a community where it was a lot like this. We didn't have a support group in our church, but our church had a lot of foster and adoptive families in it. So I really thought this is normal. This is what people do. Pastors drive large vans with lots of kids who look very different, and they all get together and their kids look like the United Nations, and this is normal. That was my experience. It took me a while to realize, like, other people don't think this is normal. I went to college and a friend saw my family picture and she's like, oh, is that your foreign exchange student? I said, no, that's my brother. She just had no exposure to that. So it's really important for your kids to be around other kids who are like them. Especially if you are going to do this and you haven't yet done it, exposing them beforehand is really important. Because then they already go, oh yeah, it's like so-and-so's family. Oh, it's like so-and-so and their family, how they brought kids into their home. It just creates a sense of normalcy, and it reduces anxiety. All right, the next one is we're kind of shifting to what happens when kids come home. So I know it's a little dramatic, but that's kind of what it feels like, right? So when I was preparing this talk, I asked a couple friends whose kids are bio kids in adoptive families to talk to me about what was hard and what was good about their experience. And one of my friends, her daughter, who was 10, at the time that they brought their two siblings home. So they had a 10-year-old biological daughter, a 7-year-old biological daughter, and then they brought home an almost 2-year-old and a 6-month-old biological brothers. And so she wrote an essay for school about their experience, and I asked her permission to share it, because I feel like, one, they did a good job of giving her a voice as a biological kid in this family to express what it was like for her. But two, this is such an articulate 10-year-old who's able to talk about what it was like to have kids come home. So this is what she said. She said, we were a happy family of 4, my sister, mom, and dad. We were in the foster adopt process, but we had no idea how hard it would be or what impact it could have in our lives. When the phone rang, we learned that the county had 2 boys, brothers ages 2 and 6 months, who needed a foster home immediately. That evening, we became a family of 6. We had no clue that adding 2 children to our family would be so hard. About 15 minutes after the social worker dropped off the boys at our house, I tried to play tag with the older of the two brothers. It blew up in my face, but it was nothing compared to the nuclear bomb that went off at bedtime. My parents somehow managed to kiss me and my sister goodnight, though. As my dad turned off the light, I whispered through tears, "I liked our family the way it was." He replied, "I know, but it will eventually get better." It was hard for all of us for a long time. My sister and I had less of our parents' time and attention because of the civil wars we fought every day. It went on like that for about a year. There were good times also. M called my friends strange names, such as couch, big bird, and chapstick, or chaspic, and G was always fun to tickle. When the tickle monster came into the house, there were explosions of laughter and instead of anger. 2 years after joining our family, they officially became members of our family. Their names changed. There's still some hard times in our family, but Dad was right. Things do get a little bit better than that first night. And I share that with you just because I think it's so important for our kids to be able to talk about it, to talk about the good stuff, the hard stuff, and to be honest. And if they can't do that, it's a hard thing for them. And what ends up happening is they either pretend that everything's fine, or they act out to tell you how hard it is. And this just simplifies it, makes it easier when we create a culture in our family of talking about stuff and talking about how hard things can be. The next slide is a picture a friend sent me that her son wrote in his journal. She said, yes, I did read his journal. Day one, I think this is the only day he wrote in his journal. He's 8. He said they have 3 kids. They're about to adopt their 3rd son. Their 2 oldest are also adopted through foster care, so this is their 8-year-old son. And he said, I don't really like my little brother because he takes up a lot of time. True, he does. He's 2.5. He takes up a lot of time. And Mom read it, and she was like, well, that's how he feels. I'm not surprised, right? He's already told me that to my face. But this is just another example of allowing honesty, being able to manage expectations. She has said to him, babies take up a lot of time, like no matter where they come from. It's a different stage. They need more from mom than you do, so they're going to need more different kinds of attention than you do. And just really talking about it honestly is helpful for kids. And being able to assess and respond to their needs proactively, like looking at your kids as you're seeing things happen and thinking like, are they doing that because of what's going on in our home? Because kids don't talk, they behave. And so we know that behavior is an expression of a need. So if your kids are behaving, you know that something is going on behind the scenes. And if you can be proactive about that and talk through what's happening in your home and give them breaks when they need breaks, give them opportunities to go be with other friends and family during times where it's really hard or stressful in your home, giving them that ahead of time can be really helpful. We had lots of friends who would call and say, can we have your oldest son over for a play date? Because they knew during certain seasons our home was really chaotic and hard for him. And so they would just reach out and take him out of that for a while so that he could have a break from the stress. And I think it's really important to think through how you can utilize the support that you have. There are a lot of friends and family members who want to support foster and adoptive families. They just don't know how. And so one of the ways that you can say is like, one of my kids is having a hard time. Can you come take him or her for an hour or 2? Can you come give this kid a break from what's going on in my home? And the next slide, again, is really one of the things that we know about kids that's the most traumatic for them is confusion. Because they don't have the ability to process information and experiences the way that adults do. And so this process of foster care and adoption is confusing for adults. So imagine how confusing it is for our kids. And when we don't talk about it, we don't make sense, and we don't normalize what's happening, they make sense of it themselves with the resources that they have cognitively. And oftentimes they make it either about themselves, because they're naturally self-centered and wired to think that the world revolves around them. And so they think, well, I'm a problem. I wasn't a good enough kid, so my mom and dad had to bring these other kids into the home. Or, you know, I don't understand why these kids behave the way they do, or why my parents have to give so much time and attention to this. They don't understand it, and so they make a story about it in their head that makes sense to them. Oftentimes it's not true and it's not helpful. So what you can do as a parent to eliminate confusion is to create a narrative around the experience that makes sense for your kids. So like when there's stuff going on, like behavior in the home that's confusing to your kids or that's stressful to your kids, saying, so-and-so does that because he has not gotten the same things that you did growing up, being born from my body, having all the time that you had, in utero. I don't use that word with my kids, but, and then being in our family your whole life. And he's experienced some things that were really hard. And maybe I talk about it more explicitly, like with my older kids, we talk about drugs. We talk about how drugs impact our brains and how it affects our choices and our ability to calm ourselves down. And we talk about that honestly because it's helpful for them. It gives them a sense of empathy for why the kids around them who've come from hard places do the things that they do. And so it eliminates a lot of the confusion around certain things. I tell my kids, I don't get to make the decisions about kids who come into our home, whether or not they're going to stay forever. That's up to the judge. It's not up to me to decide. So I really don't know what's going to happen. And being honest about that, not making up a story or telling them something that's not true, eliminates the confusion because they know now who's responsible. They know it's not you, and they can live with that. It's much easier than saying, I don't know. I don't know. It gives them kind of a concrete place to make sense of what's happening in their world. The other thing is that trauma is not secondary. I have kind of a personal issue with this when you hear people talk about trauma and secondary trauma. And what they mean is that if you're exposed to someone who's been exposed to trauma, then you're going to have secondary trauma. Well, the reality is that being exposed to trauma, whether it's coming in your home from a kid who's exposed to trauma or directly impacted by a trauma, like a natural disaster or something like that, either one is traumatic. So what your kids are experiencing, the upheaval in their home of having kids come and leave and being impacted by foster care and adoption, is in and of itself traumatic. It's traumatic for you as a parent. It's traumatic for your kids. So what your kids are experiencing, your bio kids and your permanent kids, is just as important and hard on them as the things that the kids who come into your home have been exposed to before they got there. I think it's really important to kind of even the playing field and say that nobody's experience of trauma here is any more difficult than anyone else's. So when your bio kids are having a really hard time because of the things that they're being impacted by or the changes that they're experiencing, that is just as significant and traumatic as the kids who come into your home who've experienced abuse and neglect and things like that. And so your bio kids may need the same kind of resources that your new kids coming into your home are going to need, like therapeutic services, support from you. All of those kinds of things are going to be just as important for your bio kids as they are for your kids who become permanent members of your family. Then the next slide. And the reason, kind of tailing on that last point, is that every kid in your home is going to have a different temperament. Temperament is really kind of just simply stated how our personality is impacted by our environment. So depending on what the temperament of your permanent kids are, they're each going to be impacted differently by the process of foster care and adoption. So if you were to do a survey of my 5 siblings that I grew up with, each of us would tell you a different story about how we were impacted by foster care and adoption. I was the kid who just kind of did what he was supposed to do. I wouldn't have told you that it was hard. You wouldn't have known that certain things were traumatic because I just swallowed it and kept on going, and I was the kid who did not rock the boat. I didn't realize until later that some of those things were traumatic for me. We did medically fragile infants. We fostered medically fragile infants, so a lot of the babies that we had in our home were on heart monitors and really serious medical issues. And so one of our foster babies on Christmas Eve had a cardiac arrest. So my mom had to give her CPR. We had to call the ambulance. I'm pretty sure my brother was the one who made the phone call. My dad was already at church because my dad was a pastor. It was Christmas Eve. We had Christmas Eve service. We did not make it to church. I don't remember getting to church. I'm sure my dad preached the sermon. She ended up being fine, but the picture I have in my mind is standing in the hallway, like watching it happen. And I didn't realize until later, even into adulthood, that that was a traumatic experience for me as a kid because we just kept going. That was what we did. And I didn't have the words to articulate and say like, oh my gosh, that was really scary. And I don't remember if my mom stopped and said, that must have been really scary for you to watch me give CPR to this baby. I don't remember if she did or didn't. I just know that for me, that was a traumatic experience that I was exposed to that I did not realize until later. I think we talked about it. We might have talked about it. I don't remember. But if that were to happen in my home now, which happened around Christmas time, we had a medical crisis with our baby. The ambulance came in twice. And I talked about it ad nauseum with my kids over and over and over about why that happened, why they had to come, what happened, what was happening with him medically, what the doctors were going to do, what the paramedics were going to do. And days later, they repeated the story over and over and over, because how kids make sense of trauma is by talking it out. And we just repeated the story and repeated the story and repeated the story. So each of my kids was impacted differently by that. One of my kids was like, oh yeah, he's fine, the doctor took care of it, whatever. One of my other kids talked about it weeks later. Is he still sick? Is he going to be okay? Is he going to have a seizure again? Is it going to happen? If it happens, what do we do? And then he needed to keep talking about it and talking. And in his head, he's a very anxious kid. He worries about worst case scenario. So he would say things like, if he dies, blah, blah, blah. None of my other kids were even thinking like that. It wasn't a life and death necessarily situation, but for him, it was. So I'm aware that that's his temperament, that's how his brain works. So each of your kids is going to be impacted differently by this process, and they may seem fine. I would rather you err on the side of assuming they're not, right? And talk about things and bring things up with them, and they can say, stop talking about it, I'm fine. But I would rather you err on that side than to overlook a quiet kid who's not acting out and telling you how they're feeling, because their temperament is really a big part of how they're impacted by this. All right, moving on to the next slide. So really, I think, I think we skipped one. There you go. Okay, so just a note about your permanent kids. So kids who have already been fostered and who become permanent in your home, or who are currently being fostered, change, good or bad, is traumatic for them because it represents something that was not good, right? They've experienced so much change that was hard that their brain cannot differentiate between good change and bad change, if there is such a thing, right? So you have probably experienced this with transitions to new schools or new teachers or new caregivers or new churches or whatever, but change is a trauma trigger for kids from hard places. So bringing new kids into your home is going to be hard for them. The more that you talk about it, the better it will go. Some of those kids cannot handle more transition and change at certain times. So that might be a time to consider taking a break. Like, is this too disruptive for this particular kid to have new kids come into our home? One of my kids, when we got our baby, the first question he asked is, when am I going back to my first mom? And I was like, you're not, you're adopted. I mean, I thought we've been over this 100 times. But he thought, again, wait, what if I go back? And so we had to talk about it again, over and over and over again. So even if they've been adopted for 100 years and they seem totally fine, having a new kid come into your home is probably going to be a trigger for them. And the more that you reassure them that their place in your home is not going to change, regardless of what happens with the kids who come in, the better they will do. And then really, I think this kind of during process when the bomb is going off and things are really unsettling, the next slide just says, remember why you started, right? What got you and your family into this process in the beginning? What made you feel called to this? What are the reasons that you agreed to this? And go back to that. Sit down with your kids and in the really hard times and say, why did we start? What did we talk about? What do we as a family value? We value, in our family, we talk about being a good neighbor. Part of how we're a good neighbor is by providing homes for kids in our community who might not otherwise have one. And so that's one of the things that we talk about. Like, we're a good neighbor by being a foster family. That's how we share Christ's love with other kids and other families. And so it may be a different phrase, it may be a different mantra for you and your family, but I think going back to why you started and reminding yourself and your kids in the middle of the chaos is really a helpful way to get through some of the harder times. And then afterwards, kind of adjusting to the new normal. I don't really know at what point you switch into the after. Some people it might be once their adoption is final, and some people it might be like 2 months into it. It's really more of how your family kind of settles in. Can you go to the next slide, please? The new normal will kind of shift and change as your family settles into this process and into new kids. One of the kids I talked to about this process was a 9-year. He's 9 now. He's the oldest of 3 bio siblings and a 7-year-old adopted son. And his answer to what was the best part of foster care, he said, someone is added to our family and there's one less orphan. What was the worst part? They go crazy and get out of control. And then I asked his mom to ask him, what could we have done to help you during that process that we didn't do? He said, tell us that we might have to get used to their personality, we might not like them right away, and pray that they will love us and we will love them. And then when I talked to her about it, she said, that was really hard. I said, what was hard? And she said, asking him what we could have done differently. And I said, but it doesn't mean that you can't have that conversation now, right? Or to say, I'm sorry we didn't have that conversation. Because part of what we do as parents is make mistakes and repair our mistakes. And that's how we teach our kids that we're human and what it looks like to be a human. And so if you made a mistake and you missed something, going back and apologizing and saying, gosh, I didn't know you needed that during that time, is really a way to heal your relationship with them and model asking for forgiveness so that they have the opportunity to give it. And the next slide, really, I think just kind of accepting part of the expectations is that it's never over. We never are not impacted by foster care and adoption. I mean, my oldest sibling is in her 40s, and my youngest sister is turning 30, or just turned 30, and we are still impacted as a family by foster care and adoption. As my siblings deal with their process of being adopted kids as adults, our family is still impacted by that. My oldest niece is 18, and she's my older brother's daughter. My mom was talking to her about growing up and getting married, and do you want to have kids? And she said, yeah, I'm going to have kids, but I'm going to adopt them. And my mom said, oh, really, you are? And she goes, like, well, it's in our DNA. It's what we do. So, she grew up in a family that all of her siblings are bio siblings, but her aunts and uncles are adopted. Her cousins are adopted. So for her, that's the normal thing, and she feels like that's part of who she is. So it doesn't stop impacting your kids. It will impact them differently over time and in different life stages and different developmental stages. So I think you have to continue to manage things as they come up, right? Like as your kids enter new phases of life and new challenges come up, you manage them, you talk about it again, you keep talking about it, you let them keep talking about it. I had a mom ask me at the Orphan Care Summit, what do you do when your kids are adults and they don't like each other? And I said, well, I don't know yet because my kids aren't adults, and so far they don't like each other sometimes. But I said, I think that's part of the process, right, is letting them talk about it, letting them talk about how certain things about having adopted siblings have been hard for them, and letting them as adults talk with each other about it, not just you. But it's going to come up. It's going to continue to impact your family and your kids throughout their life. You have to continue to utilize the resources that you have. So cultivating new resources as your kids get older and need new things is really important. Adopting older kids is very different than adopting infants, right? Or fostering older kids is very different than fostering infants. So the resources and the support that you need are going to be different. For us, the first time around having 2 kids come into our home was very different than the second time around where we only had 1 kid. The resources that we needed the first time were very different than the things that we needed the second time. If you're adopting kids from another country and bringing them home, it's going to be very different, right? So every family and every situation is different, and the resources that you need are different, but you have to continue to identify what the needs are in your home, what each kid needs, and then how can you utilize the things that they need. So the next slide just says, this is your new normal, right? This is it. This is what you signed up for. This is what's going on. And just kind of settling into that, I think for us, the new normal is different every day and into every season. And so really part of how we help our kids, especially our bio kids and our permanent kids, is kind of just acknowledging that it's okay that we can miss how it used to be. I miss when I was newly married and had no children. Doesn't mean I don't love my children, but I do miss that season of our life sometimes because seems really hard and stressful, but compared to now, it feels like a walk in the park, right? So it's okay to say I miss the old things. I miss the way it used to be. It doesn't mean that we're doing something wrong or that we don't love what we're doing now. We don't love our kids, but it's just acknowledging honestly how we feel. So sometimes your kids may say things like, gosh, I really liked it before we had new kids, and that's okay. It's okay that they feel that way. It doesn't mean that they don't love their siblings or they don't feel safe or loved in your home. It just means they don't really love what's going on right now, and that's okay. Or they, we always, hindsight is always 20/20. Always feel better about things after they've happened. So continue to talk about it. And then the next slide, we're almost done, is what you have on the table. So I just identified some resources that have been helpful for me or for other families that I know. The first one are books for kids. The Maybe Days book is a book for kids in foster care, but we actually found it really helpful for our bio son. It just explains the process of foster care. Who are the players involved? Why do kids come into foster care? Why do all the different aspects, what are the different roles that different people play, social workers, judges, things like that. So for our bio son, it was really helpful for him to understand what was going on. He didn't know what a social worker was. He didn't know why a judge was the one in charge of making all these decisions. And then the reason it's called Maybe Days is because some days we know what's going on in foster care and some days we don't. And some days the answer to, are you going to go home, is maybe. And some days the answer, are you going to stay, is maybe. And so that's kind of the premise of the book. Slumberkins is this online resource. They have books, therapeutic books that come with a stuffed animal, and there's one specifically for kids in foster care and for foster and adoptive families. And then The Invisible String is a book for kids about how we stay connected with people who've come and gone. So, when a parent is far away and maybe not in our life anymore, how we are still connected to them, or a sibling who has been in our home, but then maybe they reunify, how we stay connected to people through this invisible string. So it's a really simple way of helping kids process change. And then the other books, the Wounded Children Healing Homes and the Whole Life Adoption book, are both by Jane Schooler. They have them really great resources. She's a great speaker and author. She runs back-to-back ministry with her husband up in Washington. They have a lot of online resources for trauma-informed parenting. So those are two good books for parents. The Lucky Few is a book that was written by a mom who adopted all three of her kids are adopted. Two of them have Down syndrome, and one of them was adopted through foster care. And so she just really honestly writes about her experience of being a parent, managing expectations. I think it's a really great, the last page of that book I've taken a picture of and shared it with so honest. And then the last one is to the refresh in Seattle. It's a 30-day devotion for foster and adoptive parents. It's super simple, and it's each day is written by a different foster or adoptive parent. And then if you can go to the next. So some online resources, I've just listed different websites that are helpful for me or other parents that I know. And then the Count the Cost video is on the Empowered to Connect website. It's a great kind of, if you haven't already started this process, Karen Purvis talks about counting the cost of doing this and what that really looks like. I think it's a great before you do it kind of thing to watch, and if you've already done it, it might be helpful just to remind yourself. And then the next slide are podcasts that I listen to pretty regularly that are really helpful. There's a couple in each of these podcasts that talk specifically about having biological or permanent kids in your home. And they're all of these podcasts are done by parents who are foster and adoptive parents. And then the last slide are just things in our community that are resources for you that might help. The Empowered to Connect parent class, City Without Orphans offers it. My husband and I teach it or have taught it the last 2 years in the spring. And they offer it in the fall also. There's another couple that teaches it. It's a 9-week class. We teach it in 8 weeks. It has been life-changing for us as foster and adoptive parents. The curriculum and just the template for parenting in a different way has been incredibly helpful for us. So I would really encourage you, if you have never taken it, to take it, regardless of where you're at on the journey. And then there's lots of different therapeutic resources. If you're looking for a specific therapeutic resource for a specific kid in your home, I'd be happy to help you try and find it. I don't know that it's out there. Fresno is kind of a hard place right now to find some of those resources, but I'd be happy to help try and point you in the right direction. And then lastly, a couple families, and mine included, started meeting a couple years ago, moms, as just a support for one another. And in the last year, our group has really grown, and so we've developed some new resources that we'd love to make available to you. Some of those are the parent support groups. So we have a mom's group that meets and a dad's group that just started meeting. We meet every other month. We just have a meal. We share what it's like. We pray for each other and talk about parenting kids from hard places. We're going to start another group in the fall. We also would love to bring you a meal or come alongside you if you're in a time that is hard, or just sit down and talk. We have different parents that are more than happy to sit with other parents and kind of just talk through what's going on. And then the kind of biggest tangible resource that we've developed are called welcome kits. And it's a big 18-quart tub that we will deliver to you if you get a new placement. Just has stuff for your new kiddo. It has resources for you as parents. And we would just love to come alongside you. So I have some handouts, some of the flyers for that if you're interested. And then I will be happy to answer questions. Yeah. Yeah. Uh-huh. Mm-hmm. Oh. Great. Well, if you email me, I'll add you to my list. Yeah. Any other questions? Yes. Yeah. Mm-hmm. 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 Yeah, you mean like this is what's going on in our home, this is what we're doing. I think you have to be careful how you tell the story of why kids are removed because it's their story. So I'm always really careful about how I tell our kids' story for them. But in my home, I might say something like they weren't safe or they weren't making safe choices and a judge or a social worker decided that they need to live in another home for a time. And I might also just add to my kids that this is something that we share with our family and that this family, and this family, those are moms you can talk to about it, but everybody else, it's not really any of their business. So I might just kind of draw a circle around who that story belongs to, because they might want to share, and then you give them a couple people that it's appropriate to talk about it with, and then everybody else is not appropriate, and they can come to you with their questions. So that's how I might do it, yeah. Any other questions? All right. If you think of one, you can always email me. My email's on the resource list, and if you think of another resource that you want me to add, you let me know, and I will add it.